Exploring sexuality. First of all, some biological and cultural factors affect our sexuality. A big one, obviously, is our hormones. So, sex hormones do have an effect, but those effects are difficult to distinguish because human sexual behavior is so individualized. There are also cultural issues. So, between the culture you grew up in, the family you grew up in, any religious influences that you may have, these can influence your sexual script. A sexual script is a stereotyped pattern of expectations for how people should behave sexually. Now, the traditional religious gender script, the traditional religious script is that sex is acceptable only within marriage. Extramarital sex is taboo, especially for women, and sex is primarily for reproduction and showing affection, again, within the boundaries of marriage. That's one way of viewing sex. There's also the romantic script. This is the idea that sex is synonymous with love. It's just a way that you show love. So if you're in love with someone or have a lot of affection for them, then sexual activity is one of the ways that you express that. There's nothing wrong with either of those scripts. Again, people just have their own sexual scripts that have been influenced by their culture, their religion, and their own personal individual differences. Among men and women, some sexual scripts do involve double standards. So people might have one idea in their head for what's appropriate for men and what's appropriate for women, and those might not be the same thing. Then there's sexual orientation. Sexual orientation has to do with who you are attracted to. And sexuality plays a very strong role in well being. It is strongly linked to life satisfaction for both women and men. Regardless of sexual orientation, people have similar physiological responses during sexual arousal and seem to be aroused by the same types of tactile stimulation. Sexual orientation is likely determined by a combination of genetic, hormonal, cognitive, and environmental factors. Most experts believe that no one factor alone causes sexual orientation, and the weight of each factor can vary from one individual to the next. But it's important to stress that no matter the orientation, an individual cannot be talked out of it. It's not something that you choose, it's just part of who you are. So to wrap up gender and sexuality, before we move on to some other things, I found this and I thought it was a cute way of explaining it. So this is the genderbread person. So you have the ideas of gender identity, gender expression, biological sex, and sexual orientation. And we're just going to explain the differences between these terms. So first, you've got gender identity. Remember that gender identity is how you in your head think about yourself. It's just your sense of being a man or being a woman or somewhere in between. Maybe you don't identify strongly either way. There's also gender expression. This is how you demonstrate your gender through the way that you act, dress, behave, and interact with others. Some people express themselves in a very feminine way, some people express themselves in a very masculine way, and others are more androgynous. There's also biological sex. So this has to do with your hormones and your chromosomes. So if you have two X chromosomes, you are biologically a female. If you have an X and a Y chromosome, you tend to be a male. But again, this combination of the two. It's not necessarily going as clear cut as that, since you might have two X's and a Y, or just a single X, or an X and a Y, but the Y doesn't activate, so you can end up somewhere in between, which we call intersex. And then there's sexual orientation. So this is who you are physically and emotionally attracted to based on their sex or gender in relation to your own. So someone who is heterosexual is someone who is attracted to the opposite gender or sex. Someone who is homosexual is someone who is attracted to someone who is the same gender or sex as them. And then you've got bisexual, which is someone who is attracted to both males and females, or asexuals who aren't sexually attracted to anyone. Okay, completely switching gears. If we're talking about sexuality, something that is highly problematic is forcible sexual behavior and sexual harassment. So rape is sexual intercourse with a person who does not give consent. The actual number of cases is not easy to determine because a lot of people are reluctant to report incidents due to a number of factors, including the fact that very few of these incidents actually end up being prosecuted. We do know that 200,000 rapes are reported each year in the United States, so the actual number is probably much, much higher. Most of the victims are women, but rape of men does occur. When talking about male rapists, they tend to share the following characteristics. First of all, aggression enhances their sense of power or masculinity. When it comes to why people rape, rape isn't about sex, it's about control. So engaging in that aggression tends to enhance that sense of power. They tend to be more angry at women in general, and they have the goal of wanting to hurt or humiliate their victims. The most common type of rape is date or acquaintance rape. So most rape is not some person in a dark alley that jumps out at you. Most of the time, it's someone that you know. This tends to be coercive sexual activity directed at someone with whom the victim is at least casually acquainted. Something very pervasive is sexual harassment. Sexual harassment can take many forms, from inappropriate sexual remarks to physical contact to blatant proposition and sexual assaults. Millions of women experience sexual harassment each year in work and educational settings. Sexual harassment of men by women does occur, but to a far lesser extent. And of course, sexual harassment and assault can result in serious and long-lasting psychological consequences for the victims. You're probably familiar with the Me Too movement. This has helped to show the prevalence of sexual assault and harassment of women.